You're standing in a Roman market, 200 AD. The air smells like bread and animal fat. A man next to you is 52 years old, weathered, yes, but alive. His wife is 48. Their daughter just turned 19 and is not yet married. Nobody thinks this is strange. Nobody is rushing her. Now, someone tells you ancient people only lived to 35, and suddenly you're supposed to believe that same 52-year-old man was a demographic miracle, that his entire civilization was racing against a biological clock that expired before anyone hit middle age. Here's the question that cracks everything open. If ancient humans only lived to 35, why did so many of their laws explicitly forbid marriage before adulthood, and what does it mean that we forgot that? The answer isn't one thing. It's never just one thing. There's a myth about life expectancy that almost nobody corrects. There's a brain development timeline that ancient Rome somehow understood without a single MRI machine. There's a political trap that only the powerful fell into. And there's a crisis mechanism that bent every rule whenever civilization started to collapse. Each layer is more unsettling than the last. Let's go. Start with the number everyone quotes. Ancient humans lived to 35. You've heard it 100 times. It gets used to explain early marriage, early reproduction, the whole compressed timeline of ancient life. The problem is that number is doing something very specific and very misleading. It's a mean average, and it's being dragged down catastrophically by infant and child mortality, infection, famine, accident, childbirth itself. Children died in staggering numbers before age 5. That death toll collapses the average. But if you survived to age 15 in ancient Rome, your conditional life expectancy jumped to roughly 45 to 55 more years. Cole and Domeny at Princeton documented this in 1966 in their foundational demographic work on Roman-era populations. Adults who cleared the threshold of adolescence typically lived into their 50s or 60s. Roman census records from Egypt in the 1st through 3rd centuries AD are full of men and women in their 50s and 60s. Skeletal analysis at the Anglo-Saxon burial site at Raunds-Fernals in Northamptonshire shows significant numbers of individuals who lived to 45 through 65. Studies of the Kungsan of the Kalahari, used as a living analog for ancient hunter-gatherer populations, show a median adult lifespan of 54, with many individuals reaching their 60s. The number everyone quotes to explain ancient marriage wasn't measuring how long adults lived. It was measuring how many children never got the chance to. Now, let's talk about the brain. Because here's where it gets strange. People assume that once the body could reproduce, ancient cultures treated that person as an adult. Done. Ready. The biology gave the signal and the culture responded. Except ancient cultures drew a much more careful line than that, and they drew it in almost exactly the right place, without knowing why. The prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain governing judgment, long-term planning, and impulse control, is not fully developed until the mid-20s. Sarah Jane Blakemore at University College London demonstrated in 2012 via MRI imaging that synaptic pruning in the prefrontal cortex is actively ongoing at age 18 to 20 in healthy subjects. The brain is still being built. An ancient law, without any of that science, somehow landed on the same conclusion. Roman law set full legal autonomy at 25. The Roman lex laetoria of around 191 BC specifically protected individuals under 25 from financial exploitation, on the legal assumption that their judgment was incomplete. Jewish Talmudic tradition set full witness and contract capacity at 20. Aristotle placed rational maturity at 21. The Athenian Ephebeia kept 18-year-olds in mandatory civic training for 2 years, precisely because Greeks viewed them as physically ready but socially unfinished. The Aztec Calmecac and Telpocalli schools kept adolescent males in supervised institutional life until around age 20 to 22 before granting full adult status. The body hits reproductive readiness roughly a decade before the brain hits social cognitive readiness. Evolution never resolved that gap. Ancient Rome didn't have neuroscience, but it still drew the line at 25. The brain told them, even if they couldn't name it. And the laws themselves? People assume ancient legal codes had no minimum age for marriage, that children were property, contracted away without restriction. The actual documents say something different. Roman law set minimums at 12 for girls and 14 for boys, but those were floors, not targets. Bagnall and Fryer at Columbia in Michigan analyzed over 300 papyrus census documents from Roman Egypt in 1994 and found median female first marriage age of 17 to 18, with men marrying at 25 to 28. The Babylonian Code of Hammurabi from around 1754 BC required formal betrothal contracts with waiting periods, with child arrangements explicitly conditional on future physical maturity. The Visigothic Code of the 7th century AD in Iberia prohibited marriage before 15 for girls and imposed penalties on families who violated it. Under the Byzantine Ecloga of 726 AD, betrothals of children under 7 were legally void in consummation before female puberty was criminalized. Demosthenes in 4th century BC. Athens documented men marrying around 30 and women between 14 and 18, with that gap being a social institution, not a scandal. Ancient law was tracking biological and economic readiness simultaneously. Puberty was the floor, not the target. The ancients didn't lack rules about childhood. They lacked our assumption that the rules were always being followed. Up to this point, this looks like a story about biology and law. But the deeper you go, the more it becomes a story about power and who had enough of it to break every rule we just described. Early marriage was not universal. It was concentrated almost surgically in one demographic, the political elite during periods of dynastic instability. Jack Goody at Cambridge documented in 1983 that elite early marriage in medieval Europe functioned as a property and alliance transfer mechanism, structurally distinct from peasant marriage patterns, where economic household formation drove later average ages of 26 to 28 for men and 22 to 24 for women in medieval England. Common people married when they could afford a household. Aristocrats married when a dynasty needed an heir. Isabella of Valois was married to Richard II of England in 1396 at age 6. The formal contract required that the marriage not be consummated until she was of age. That clause existed precisely because everyone involved knew early consummation caused harm. Aztec noble girls entered political marriages in early adolescence, while commoner women, per the Florentine Codex, compiled by Sahagún in the 16th century, typically married between 16 and 20. A throne with no heir under pre-modern mortality conditions was a dynasty that might not survive the year. The ruthlessness of early political marriage was a feature of power scarcity, not cultural approval. Behind almost every famous child bride in history, there's a throne with no heir and a family running out of time. Now, the darker part of this, because it has to be said, political and economic desperation produced genuine child marriages that caused documented, irreversible harm. And the cultures that allowed it often knew it. Margaret Beaufort, born in 1443, was married at 12 to John de la Pole during the Wars of the Roses. She gave birth at 13 to the future Henry VII. Contemporary accounts and later medical analysis suggest the delivery caused permanent pelvic damage. She never conceived again across 2 subsequent marriages. She later became one of the most powerful women in Tudor England and documented deep personal regret about early marriage in her own writings and used her influence to establish regulations against early marriage for women in her household. Agnes of France was contracted to Byzantine Emperor Andronikos I in 1180 at age 9. He was 64. The marriage was consummated. It existed to legitimize Andronikos' seizure of the regency, making Agnes a mechanism in a coup. He was murdered in 1185. She survived, married twice more, and died in her 30s in Greece. What both cases share is structure. A political actor with a short time horizon overriding the biological and social norms the broader culture maintained. These cases required extraordinary pressure to execute. The fact that they required legal contracts specifying delayed consummation produced harm that contemporaries noted and were later cited as cautionary examples in political and legal writing. All of this confirms the broader culture recognized early marriage as damaging. The exception required overriding the norm, not expressing it.